So we're starting Genesis. Genesis is the Greek name from the Hebrew name Bereshith.
It's time to change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Genesis. So grab your Bible. We'll be starting in chapter 39.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
And she starts pulling him toward her. And she tells him something like, "You might look great, but you're just a slave, and you'll do what I tell you." And as she pulls his robe toward her, he slips out of it. And it's not like Joseph ran through the house naked. Mrs. Potiphar grabbed his outer robe. Joseph still had on his linen undergarment. And this is the second time that Joseph has been wrongly stripped of his robe. The last time it was by his brothers to deceive their father, but this time it's by an adulterous woman to try to deceive her husband. And it probably didn't come to her right away. And she's just probably sitting there for a moment, and she's holding Joseph's robe, and she's mad, and she's been rejected again. And she thinks, well, how am I going to explain why I have Joseph's robe? And he's already outside, and you wonder if any of the other servants had seen him running out, if there was any kind of time lapse, if there was any kind of pause. And then you hear Mrs. Potiphar scream, oh man, get in here, look at this." And now Mrs. Potiphar, she's sitting there on her couch, and her clothes are all disheveled, and her hair's all messed, and she smeared her makeup. And the very first thing she points out to them is that Joseph, well, he's a foreigner, and that it was her husband Potiphar who put this foreigner in charge of them. And so she's appealing to the other servants' envy of Joseph's position, because she's trying to get them to back up her lies and add credibility to her story. And she says, "He came in here to mock me." And Mrs. Potiphar, she's holding on to Joseph's robe that whole day until her husband comes home. And then she repeats to him the same story. But this time, she blames Potiphar. She says, "It's your fault, Potiphar." And the adulteress, well, she blames her husband. And she says, "The Hebrew you brought into us, you did it." So she allies herself with these other servants, and she says, calling them us. So she includes herself with the servants. And then we read that Potiphar, his anger's aroused. But what we don't read here is that how Potiphar, he had to send out a search party to find Joseph, or how he had to chase Joseph down as a runaway slave. Because I believe that Joseph, he was just still waiting outside, because he's waiting to see how things are going to play out, because he did nothing wrong. He's innocent. And Potiphar is so mad. You would wonder, well, why didn't Potiphar just kill him? Because I'm sure Potiphar was in a position where he had killed lots of men before, and it would have been legal, because Joseph was just property. He was a slave. And he's not being accused of just taking a few extra cookies at lunch. He's being accused of rape, and it's the rape of Potiphar's wife. And even being so angry, Potiphar, he knows Joseph's character because he's known him for a long time. And Potiphar, he knows his wife's character, and she's probably lied to him before. And so it seems that Potiphar, he may not have really believed her. But she did have Joseph's robe, and he had to do something. And it could be Potiphar really did believe Joseph here, but it's also very possible that Potiphar also beat Joseph here, trying to get a confession from him, because being a cop, Cops can usually tell when someone's lying to them, because this makes absolutely no sense for Potiphar to put Joseph as a slave into prison for the rape of one of Pharaoh's officers' wives, because that would have been a capital crime. And some ancient rabbis taught that Mrs. Potiphar spoke to her husband to spare Joseph, to have him put in prison so she could take advantage of him later. But to me, that's not really likely, but who knows? But it's right here at the highest point of Joseph's career where he can almost see what God is doing toward the fulfillment of his calling and the dreams that he'd been given, where these dreams just started to make sense again. And then it all comes crashing down. And he's worse off than when his brothers sold him into slavery. Because now he's a prisoner for life, which is worse than being a slave. Because how much more freedom can you be stripped of? So Joseph, he's humbled again. And all his dreams die again. But God's working. Because you see, God had to move Joseph out of Potiphar's house. And God has already taught Joseph everything he needed to learn in that house. But God, he has so much more to teach him to become the man that he's calling him to be. And how would Joseph ever be released from Potiphar and be removed from Potiphar's house? Potiphar was never going to set Joseph free. Joseph was way too valuable. And if you really think about it, it's Potiphar who has the greatest loss here, because now he has to go home and he has to run his own household, and he's still stuck with his adulterous wife. And you might want to think here, well, it really didn't turn out that bad for Joseph. You know, Potiphar probably believed him, and it looks like Potiphar put a good word in for him, because now Joseph's running the whole prison. And you might want to think that. But that's not true, because that's not how it happened. And even though Joseph is innocent of all those charges, and even if Potiphar does believe him, Joseph is not only accused of rape, but he's convicted, and he's now a convicted sex offender. And it was no different then than it is today. Joseph would have been despised by everyone, even by the other prisoners. And we have some insight to what happened to Joseph in Psalm 105 in verses 17 and 18. And it says, he sent a man before them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. They hurt his feet with fetters and was laid in irons. And the other translation says it was bronze fetters, and that his neck was put into irons. So Joseph, he didn't start in prison at the top. And Potiphar, he didn't do Joseph any favors here. And so Joseph, he was abused by all those guards and by the prisoners. But then it says, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in sight of the keeper of the prison. So it was just like it was in Potiphar's house. Joseph was elevated over time. He started at the bottom again. And the keeper of the prison, he learned, just like Potiphar learned, that this was a gifted young man and that Joseph could make his work easier because he can handle all the responsibilities well. So Joseph, he's learning again, but now it's just not how to run a large house, but it's how to manage a large institution. Because again, this is a preparation for his calling. And this is the way it is for all of God's people. They need to learn to be a servant before they can be a leader. And they need to be under authority before they can exercise authority. Because God, he is a big believer in servant leadership. And we see this all the way through the Bible. We see it here with Joseph, and then we see it again through the life of Moses, where he was out shepherding his father-in-law's sheep for 40 years. We see it in the life of David, who was also a shepherd, but then he also went through God's discipline program of hard times because he was pursued by Saul as an enemy for about 8 years before he fulfilled his calling and him becoming the king. And Jesus himself, well, he spent 30 years as a servant in training before his 3 years of ministry. And Jesus even taught his disciples in Luke 22:26, "He who is greatest among you, let him be as the younger. He who governs as he who serves." And this is what God has been doing in Joseph's life. And this is what God is doing in our lives. And we can see here that Joseph, even with all these trials, that he clings to the Lord because he believes in the Lord, no matter what his circumstances are. And really, if you look at it, where else does Joseph have to go? And if you look at it again, you look at your own circumstances, where else do we have to go? We could go back to the world, but there's nothing there. To the drinking or to drugs or to whatever your rebellion was. But they'll never deliver us from anything. They'll never give us a future. They can only lead us into a deeper bondage. And then this chapter ends with, "The Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper." And so here, we need to learn that as believers, that the Lord, he is also with us. And he doesn't always deliver us from our circumstances, but he's always with us in our circumstances. In fact, in many cases, he actually placed us into those circumstances because he's using them to teach us and to train us to be the persons of character that he's created us to be for his calling in our lives. And we may not see God leading us, and we might be blind to it, but he's putting things into us. And we're learning from all the trials and all the troubles that we go through. And the truth is, they take time. Because just like here, it seems like nothing is happening. But the things that he's doing, you're going to need those things for later. Joseph doesn't know he's going to need these things for later. But you see, God, he sees our future. We don't see it. But our future, it's a grand future, and it's a great future. And it could be things that God had already placed into your hearts. But we also see here that Joseph, he didn't sit around and he didn't dwell in self-pity. He trusted God in spite of his circumstances. And we see Joseph here that he's speaking to everyone he meets about God, to everybody that he encounters. But this walk that Joseph has with God, he walks with God alone. He doesn't have anyone to walk with him. And he accepts every one of his circumstances as if they are from God, no matter what the people have ever done to him. And you can see how he had a hard childhood and he was abused, but that didn't stop him from trusting God. He allowed God to teach him through all those things. And some of those things he learned, he could have learned no other way. So you may have had a hard childhood, and you may have been abused, but that's no reason to stop trusting God. You might have a job you hate, and you might have been there for a long time, but God can be with you in that job, and he can prosper you. And he has the power to remove you from that job when his work in you from that job is finished. And God, he can deliver you from temptation. If your life is committed to him, he can help you stand even when you've been falsely accused, and he can keep you from sin. When you are a Christian and your life is in him, you can trust him, and you should. And you can receive all your circumstances as if they've been given to you from him personally. And you can know that he loves you and that he always has your best in mind, even if it's hard, even if you've been wronged, even if it takes a long time, and even when you can't see what he's doing. But if you're not a Christian, and if you don't believe, and you don't have a relationship with him, this doesn't apply to you. But if you give your life to Christ, God will make sense of all your past, and he will give you a future that nobody can take away from you. So when we last left Joseph, he was running the prison, but he was running it as a prisoner. So Joseph is what we would call nowadays a trustee, which is a prisoner with a job. And it was probably like it is today. If you are a trustee, you are probably allowed a few extra privileges. Maybe better food, maybe more food, or a different robe to distinguish you from the other prisoners, which would give you more access to other places within the prison. And it's always better to have a job in the prison than to do nothing, because prison days are long days. And if Joseph was only to look at his circumstances, as far as he would know that this would be for the rest of his life. Because Joseph, he didn't have any promises from God, as far as we know, for being released from the prison. He only had those 2 dreams that someday his family would come and bow before him. And so, as a high-level trustee, Joseph, he has access to the prison where the white-collar criminals were kept. And these high-profile criminals, they were from Pharaoh's house. This is from his royal court, Pharaoh's very own cabinet members. And these 2 prisoners, they haven't been sentenced yet. And so this is where these 2 men from Pharaoh's house would have waited for their day in court, which would be before the Pharaoh. And they would have probably had it a little better than the general population. And the reason is because you really wouldn't want to offend anybody that might be restored back to power. And Joseph, he would have known how to serve these 2 men and to make their stay comfortable, because he has that kind of experience back from Potiphar's house. And that's what he was trained to do, to serve officials without being offensive. And so we're told that these white-collar criminals were the chief butler and the chief baker. And the place of confinement that they were kept was called the house of the captain of the guard. And we know who this is because we read about him last week. He's no other than our good old friend, Potiphar. Potiphar is the captain of the guard. And so it appears that Potiphar, he really didn't believe his wife about Joseph's attempted rape, and he's moved him over to his area of the prison, because last week we saw that Joseph, he was serving the keeper of the prison, but he's not there any longer. Now he's working for his old boss, Potiphar. And these 2 men, the butler and the baker, it says that they weren't kept in prison for a short time. It says that they had been there for a while. And so Potiphar, he put Joseph in charge of serving them. And we know that the chief butler, that his position would have also been known as the king's cupbearer. And he would have been the one that was in charge and responsible for Pharaoh's wine. And we know a little bit about cupbearers from the book of Nehemiah, because Nehemiah, he was the cupbearer to the king Artaxerxes. And we know that this chief butler would have been a very close and a very trusted advisor to the Pharaoh. And he probably didn't only deal just wine. He was an advisor, and he probably may have very well have been his friend. And he would have been around the Pharaoh every day, all day long. And he'd be tasting his wine to make sure it was adequate, and more importantly, that it wasn't poisoned. Because all kings have rivals, and their rivals are always trying to take their thrones. So this chief butler, he would have had to have been a wise man, and he would have had to have been a trustworthy man. And what the chief butler's position would have been in being in charge of the Pharaoh's wine, the chief baker, he would have had that same type of position preparing the Pharaoh's food. And so they both had positions of honor and trust, and they would have been very close to the Pharaoh. And it says that they offended the Pharaoh, which doesn't mean that they called him names or they said anything off color to him. But what it's believed to have happened is that there had been some type of an attempt on the Pharaoh's life. And it had to do something with either the food or the drink, or maybe both, but it was probably some type of poisoning. And Pharaoh, he wasn't going to take any chances, so he put them both in prison until things were sorted out. But in the bigger picture, from God's perspective, the real reason that these 2 were put into prison was to meet Joseph. And nothing is coincidence. And that's what ancient rabbis used to say. They said, there is no such thing as coincidence. So Joseph, he's been serving these two guys for a while, and he knows these men pretty well. And so one day he walks in, and he's probably bringing them their morning coffee with their pastries and their newspaper, the Egyptian Times or Egypt Today. And they're obviously saddened, and they're visually upset. And they usually weren't that way. This was much more than the normal prison blues. They were troubled by their dreams. And this gives us a little bit of insight into Joseph. And it shows us that he was a sensitive man, and he's concerned about the well-being of others as much as himself, and that he's also a very discerning man. What this tells us is that Joseph, he's not filled with bitterness and anger or self-pity from his own circumstances, which means that he hasn't only been focusing on just himself or only his own troubles. But if Joseph did that, he would have been perfectly justified. Nobody would be able to blame him because we already have read everything that he's already been through. But if he did, if he was self-absorbed and full of self-pity, he wouldn't be the man that he is. Because you see, Joseph, what he does is he receives every circumstance as if it had been prepared for him by God. And at the very least, he knows that God has seen it, and God has approved it, and God has allowed it, and he trusts God. Now, it seems like nowadays, people, they're often directed, and it's by people who want to help them, but they always try to get them to go inward for their answers, to find solutions to their lives, as if peace can be found inside of themselves. In counselors, they'll advise their clients to examine their deep hurts and how they've been wronged, as if somehow self-pity would be able to help them, to give them some kind of insight. But if Joseph did that, it would have only made him bitter because he was wronged by almost everybody. He would find no peace by looking inside of himself. And if that's what he did, all he would be able to find is the justification to be angry, which would have created hatred. And it would be hatred in his heart for those people that had wronged him. So then he would be no good to help anyone else, and he wouldn't even be good to even help himself. So the same set of circumstances that makes one person better, well, they can make another person bitter. It's all how you look at it. So Joseph, his focus isn't inward, but he's focused outward. He's more concerned about others, and he's serving God by serving the others put around him. And if you ever notice that people who do serve others, they always seem to have much more joy and peace, no matter what type of circumstances they have. And we see that with Jesus, he always served others. And he served them in all his circumstances, through all his persecutions, all the way up to the cross. And he's still serving others today. Because self-pity is a trap. Because what it does, it denies one's faith in God. It denies the belief that God loves you.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,